Housing is a hot topic. Tonight, our objective is to have a healthy conversation about unlocking the rental housing puzzle. Hello, I'm Stuart McNish, and you're listening to Conversations Live. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series addressing the big issues of our time. For each episode, we bring together subject matter experts for a deep conversation designed to provide you with information that helps you make more informed decisions. I hope you enjoy it.
Vancouver has a rental vacancy rate of less than 1%. And according to CMHC, we have the highest rental rates in Canada. Victoria is the third most expensive, and it's going to get worse.
Simple supply and demand would say that very, very tight supply, growing demand on the population side should be leading to pretty significant increases in rental rates, and that is certainly what's happening.
Rental demand is expected to soar over the next 30 years.
We're going back to a situation largely that we saw when the post-World War II boom came of age and moved out of their parental house. Back then, if we look back to 1981, the largest absolute age group in Canada and in the Lower Mainland was in the 15 to 24-year-old age group.
Ramlow says the demographics today mirror those of 1980, with the 25 to 34-year-old age group being the largest cohort.
So why is that? There's two reasons on the demography side. Kids of the post-World War II boom are now aging through those stages of the life cycle, and then the federal immigration target's going up to 500,000 a year.
And the majority of people within both of those groups rent. That begs the question, where will they live? Last year, there were more purpose-built rental units added to the market in Vancouver than any other year since 1990. Unfortunately, it's nowhere near the number needed, Landlord BC says, estimating that more than 5.8 million units need to be built in the next 7 years if we hope to keep rentals within reach of the average wage earner. Addressing the need won't be easy without a significant influx of private equity, money that currently is reluctant to invest.
It used to be that the only time private developers would build rental housing is when there was a federal government program to help subsidize the financing costs and rents. Do you think it's time that we had more federal programs like MIRBs and CCA, which encourage private investors, doctors, dentists, and others to invest in rental housing?
That may help, but it's only one part of the rental housing puzzle.
How do we bring more private investment to non-market housing, working with provincial government?
It's a good question, and once again, only one element in the rental housing puzzle. As Andy Ramlow points out, all levels of government need to work together.
And that's from the municipal level in terms of things like approvals or looking at municipally owned sites to put rental on, up to the provincial government, but then right up to the federal side of things as well. If we look back to that 1980s period where the previous big bulge of post-World War II boomers got out of the parental house and into the housing market, CMHC and the federal government had all kinds of programs. The MIRB program, they guaranteed for co-op and social housing, they would write down to a 2% lending rate. So all levels of government need to get on board. I think the other leg to that stool as well is we need to see all of our local communities get on board as well. This notion of community resistance and NIMBYism, we can't be just pointing the finger at everybody else to say it's somebody else's challenge to deal with. We at the community level all have to get behind some of these changes.
The rental environment is complex and includes rent controls, social housing, and myriad rules and regulations, all of which most people agree are important, but become large barriers, especially now that interest rates have risen.
Welcome to Conversations Live, Unlocking the Rental Housing Puzzle. Tonight we come to you from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, who have lived on and continue to call these lands home. For all of us who do call these lands home as well, housing is a hot topic. Bob Rennie says, housing has become so politicized that we're unable to have healthy conversations about it. He goes on to say when Premier Eby and the NDP talk supply, they're heralded as seeking a solution. But when Kevin Falcon and the BC United or Liberals talk about supply, they're seen as lining the pockets of developers. He says it's a tough perception to change, all of which makes having constructive conversations difficult. Tonight, our objective is to have a healthy conversation about the complex and massive rental housing puzzle and hopefully find the edges of that puzzle and start to piece together an image of a plan that can help ignite new rental supply. We have an impressive panel. They are Jill Atkey, the CEO of the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, John Stovell, President and CEO Reliance Properties and the chair of the Urban Development Institute, Wendy Waters, the VP of Research Services and Strategy at GWL Realty Advisors, and Michael App, Director of Housing, Planning, and Development, Metro Vancouver. As well, Dan Fumano of the Vancouver Sun is with us, and whom you just saw in the video, of course, and he'll also be asking questions of the panel tonight. Now, just before we begin, I want to express my wholehearted gratitude to the sponsors who make this evening possible. They are Stem Cell Technologies, Fortis BC, Landlord BC, Polygon, Beatty, the Port of Vancouver, Investing News Network, and Research Co., and our media partner is the Vancouver Sun. And we have supporters such as the Surrey Board of Trade and Canadian Beef. And I want to especially thank Apogee Public Relations, and I have to give a big shout out to the crew at Oh Boy Productions, who are experts in live online and virtual event production. One last thing for viewers online, you will see a Slido dialog box on your screen. Please feel free to post a question. Sean, our Slido master, will be receiving your questions and bringing them forward to us. And while I may not use all of your questions or even word them exactly as you have, they will inform me about other topics and questions that need to be addressed. So, to further set the stage, here's Mario Canseco of Research Co., who conducted the poll on the rental housing issue for Conversations Live. Amy, can you roll that tape, please?
For almost 2 in 5 residents of Metro Vancouver, housing is the most important issue at the start of 2023. Other matters, such as healthcare and jobs, have a lower ranking. It is important to note that concerns over housing are more frequent among Metro Vancouverites aged 18 to 34. When Metro Vancouverites ponder 2 ideas that could boost rental options across the region, the desire for action is very high. More than 7 in 10 residents are ready to reduce red tape and allow more affordable rental units to hit the market, as well as to facilitate the use of public land for future housing developments. Metro Vancouverites seem to have reacted well to the regulations recently implemented by the BC government. Almost 2/3 are satisfied with the decision related to strata age guidelines, and more than half are in favor of allowing all units in a lot to be rented out. A few years ago, the BC government suggested that renters in households with an annual household income of up to $80,000 should be eligible for a renter's rebate. This pledge has not gone unnoticed by Metro Vancouverites, with 59% saying that the rebate should be implemented, a number that rises markedly among those who are currently renting. Compared to the state of affairs in late 2021, Metro Vancouverites are now more hopeful in the capability of their municipal governments to deliver affordable housing. The level of confidence fell slightly for both the BC and the federal administrations. For Conversations Live, I'm Mario Canseco from Research Co.
Thank you, Mario. Now to our panel. So, to all of you panelists, do we accept the premise that we need an extraordinary number of new rental housing units in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley over the next 30 years? This is not a short-term issue. The number is so significant that to address it, we must first address how are we going to get beyond the obstacles and challenges of building new rental housing. So to each of you, what are the negative and positive levers, and how do we apply them to, one, accelerate development and put brakes on disincentives? Jill, I'd like to start with you.
Great. Thanks for the question and thanks for getting us started. It's really great to be here with you this evening. I was reflecting this morning that back in 2017, we put together a plan that called for a significant build out of 115,000 units over 10 years, rental units directed at low and moderate income households. And at the time, that number seemed to shock people. And now here we are 5 years later, and it's pretty accepted as the number we need. And in fact, people are saying that might be a bare minimum. And so the challenge is there. I don't think you'll hear from anyone on the panel that we don't have a significant rental supply challenge. I think that's pretty commonly accepted. What our challenge before us is how to enable that supply over the next 10, 20 years. And if we accept that a healthy, robust supply of rental housing is going to help to bring down rents or to stabilize rents, we're at least a generation away from that happening. So what are we doing in the meantime? And pulled together a couple of slides that I think just help to set the context really nicely. So one looks at the federal investments over time since the 1940s up until 2020. So never mind the colors on that slide, those just speak to different housing programs. But the level of investment back going back to the 1960s and 1970s was significant. So in those peak years, nearly 1 in every 5 homes built in this country were nonprofit and co-op homes that provided livable, affordable, and sustainable homes for generations of people. There's still families living in those homes today. And when we hear about federal investment under the National Housing Strategy, that's the bars in green at the tail end of that slide. We're nowhere near the level of investment we used to see. So there's no doubt we need a significant scaling up of investment federally and provincially as well. And then we've also got significant build out happening now. So 400 nonprofit and co-op buildings currently under development, in large part thanks to provincial investments. And I think a bit of a reality check, median income for renter households is in and around $60,000 as a household income. And that's sort of what we're trying to target. So $60,000 and below as a household income. And this slide here takes a look at a project in Delta. So what does it take to make housing affordable? This was a project brought forward by Affordable Housing Society in Delta. Break-even rents, so taking the profit out as we do in the nonprofit sector, break-even rents on average were about $1,950 a month. That's with no investment from government. And then you layer in significant federal and provincial investment, and then you're getting down to rents in the range of about $1,300 a month. So that brings down rents significantly, and it shows the impact of that level of investment from senior levels of government. And all of a sudden, that's affordable now to somebody earning $52,000 household income rather than $78,000. And then you layer in municipal incentives. So the municipality waived the DCCs, and that brings rents down almost another $100 a month. So all of that combined, and to be clear, it's not easy to line up 3 partners in this way. It's kind of like a unicorn. It does happen, but it's a real challenge, and it takes years to get a project like this brought forward. But that's the level of investment required to achieve affordable rents on day one. And we need to be seeing much more of that level of investment to get at those households whose needs are not being met by the market. And even with new supply, will continue to struggle for the short and medium term.
So in this sector of the market, are you able to move faster towards completion or delivering units onto the market than anybody else? Or are you handcuffed by all the same challenges that every developer faces?
Yeah, certainly. We've got the same challenges in the nonprofit and co-op sectors, moving a project forward through the approvals process as a private sector developer does. There are municipalities where nonprofit projects are streamlined, and certainly we're seeing increasingly more incentives are on the table. But it doesn't mean the project necessarily moves faster, and we've got to line up 3 different partners on the same project, which actually slows a project down. And then there are additional challenges sometimes that municipalities will layer on with housing agreements. So locking in rents before you have that funding in place can really slow a process down by years, actually. So a project like that is going to take from point of conception to people moving into their new homes. You're looking at 5, 6, 7 years.
So, Michael, to go to my question, and you're more in a position to do something about this, or at least affect how some of those levers are, turned on or turned off. What can be done to help move the process forward so that we can get units onto the market quicker?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm going to go back actually to my experience as Director of Planning for City of North Vancouver, which is a small municipality. We call it a postage stamp of a municipality, 56,000 people in the City of North Vancouver. But we've managed in City of North Vancouver to deliver significantly more rental housing than many other municipalities. So I think there is, in terms of those levers that you're pulling, there are some that can be effective. And we had the good fortune in City of North Vancouver through political leadership to be able to run essentially a natural experiment on that topic. So we could look at what were we able to offer versus a comparable municipality, and what's the end result in terms of how many rental units are you actually delivering on the ground. So what we did in City of North Vancouver is we actually looked at what does it take for a rental project to be comparable to the highest and best use, as we call it. So it would have to be as profitable, as attractive as the condominium development that the market generally wants to develop. In order to do that, we pulled a number of different levers. So we looked at, I think Jill already mentioned the DCCs. So we looked at a partial waiver of DCCs. I think we were one of the only municipalities to do that for rental housing. Full waiver of any community amenity charges. So we said rental housing is the amenity. We want as much rental housing as possible. City of North Van, somewhat unique, already 50% rental housing. We wanted to maintain that balance. We thought that was about the right number, but the market wasn't going to deliver that without these levers. So we waived all the CACs and said the rental project is the bonus. We're going to give you more density. You can build more when you're trying to do a rental project. And then we looked at every other lever that we could think of. So lower parking requirements, trying to look at approval timelines, although that's a challenging one to actually realize in practice, but kind of going the full gamut so that project would be at least comparable and the market would want to deliver it. And the end result was in the City of North Vancouver, I think last year in terms of completions, we had 650 rental housing units out of, as the whole region, 3,800, which was a record for the region, but also a record for City of North Vancouver. And when you look at that on a per capita or comparative basis, significantly above its weight and way higher than any of the other municipalities in the region. So I think it does show that, natural experiment-wise, the policies can work if you're pulling the right levers.
You're nodding, Wendy. Over to you.
Okay. Yes, we actually have a development that just finished in the City of North Vancouver, so have some experience. And yes, it's an easier municipality to work with, I think my development colleagues would say. But what are the levers? I think to go back to Jill and just, what Michael ended with, there's still the approvals challenge that this project that's just opening there, it was basically 7 years from when we got the site to people are moving in today. We also have one on Robson Street, similar time frame. And we manage the money of pension funds, and pension funds invest in real estate as about 10 to 15% of their holdings to use the income to pay out unit holders. So the pensioners, this money is what pays people's pensions. So when they put money into building a rental project, they really need it to be into an income-producing property, producing funds for the pensioners within probably 5 years would be the ideal. It was 3 years to build, so it's about 3 years to build. So then 2 years to get through every part of the approvals process would be nice. It said it took longer than that. So that's, I think, one thing that could change for the capital that builds rental housing that's, say, from pension funds is it needs to be faster. Obviously, there's some municipalities trying really hard, but there's still, and both of these projects didn't have a lot. I guess the North Van one had a public hearing, but the City of Vancouver one did not. So in a minute, John may tell us how long it takes if you need a public hearing. And certainly we know that can take even longer. So I would say the one thing is trying to find a way to get things to the approvals and under construction faster. And that's the first thing. And then, the other thing is, how some of the restrictions on what you can rent units for in the future can make a project less viable. And then sometimes they don't get built. So you've got the time, and then you've got the situation of the future rent flow and whether that's going to be enough for the pension funds. And so rent controls are one that can be a bit of a barrier as well. Right now, inflation, we know what inflation's running at. Inflation on the costs at rental, at the rental buildings is higher, even higher. And yet, rent control is at 2%. And the costs are higher. So we still have new sites in this market, but some of the other pension funds that work in this market and the pension fund managers are taking a really serious look, and our clients are as well. Where else in North America can you build housing where it's faster and you have more certainty that your rents can keep up with inflation?
And you have an answer to that question that you just posed?
Of
where you can build faster?
Outside of this, not in the Lower Mainland, would be. But one would be, I think, Calgary could be maybe a place where a lot of investors are going to look to go back to, because the vacancy rates are down to 2%. In the purpose-built rental, they added, I believe it was something like 48,000 new people last year. So it was a lot of population growth. It absorbed the existing rental stock. So I suspect we'll see some capital go there. The United States obviously has, there's a lot of options. Some of the private capital, some of the more family money in this market that's really experienced at building housing has been building up and down the west coast of North America in particular. And adding to the housing supply there, and choosing to do that. Whereas, so there's a lot of capital available. We just we can make it easier, and there's money to build rental housing in this market.
Yeah, and that capital is going elsewhere. John, from your perspective, you you're your own company, but you also represent the Urban Development Institute.
Right. Yeah.
As you hear this and you think about what's available to us and what's standing in the way, how do you answer that question? What do we do?
I think it was our past mayor who had the statistic that something like over 90% of the developable land in the region is owned by the private sector. And you hear our colleagues struggling to put partnerships with government together and multi-levels of government funding and agencies and so on. But undoubtedly, to me, the solution is to unlock the power of the private sector. And we've got almost unlimited resources. And if we could change the rules of the game so that there was a competitive advantage for that capital to go into this product, we'd be amazed at the results and how quickly they would occur. What we have instead, due to a whole series of decades long of planning processes, is government that's profoundly, I'm going to say it again, profoundly obstructionist to the formation of housing, whether it's condominium housing or rental housing. And I mean the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments. They're all equally involved in making housing very difficult. And instead of, and Wendy's hinted at it, instead of finding ways to encourage that capital to come to our market to invest and take those risks on those projects, it seems just about everything they do, both from an approvals timing point of view, but also setting unreasonably high hurdles for formation of housing, and then very frightening and uncertain regulatory environment for rental housing once it's built. To me, I'm going right to government. I mean, in the middle of 2022, we have two other big problems with formation of rental housing, which is, of course, interest rates and construction costs. But those will be things that will get sorted out over time. The one I don't see getting fixed, and one we have to fix, is we have to get government out of the way. And we can talk about what the different levels of government are doing to screw up rental housing and all types of housing, but the list is as long as your arm, in both arms. So, yeah.
But do we get government out of the way? Because we heard Andy Ramlow say, no, they have to come together. They have to be working in harmony to be able to create
the more
programs.
Government that are looking at your project, the longer it'll take to get approved. I mean, if you ever hear the city say they're going to be expedited processing of a permit, it just means it'll take longer because more people have to look at it to make sure it's moving quickly. It's just, we've got to get government out of it. We've got to get government to stop micromanaging every single aspect of every single project. And at the end of the day, the real problem is that we're all trying to work for people who are unhoused or aren't housed yet. But municipal governments are elected by people who are housed. So you've got the fox guarding the chickens. The municipal politicians are not working for the people who need housing. They're working for people who have housing. And until we fix that, we're not going to fix anything.
So how do we fix that?
We've got to get senior governments to basically, and we've, through UDI, and I've had involvement with now Premier Eby, when he was housing minister, probably the best educated premier in the history of the province on housing and what the issues are. And at the federal level, we've really just got to get municipal level of government who are in charge of town planning and land approvals. We've got to get them operating in a way that they understand that they're working for the needs of the greater society to provide housing and not working for the vested interests of the housed.
Dan, you have a question? Should I grab the microphone there, okay?
Thanks. So on that note, apart from building new rental housing, you touched on Premier Eby, who previously was housing minister. And earlier this year, was it late last year, he announced this housing acquisition fund. I think it was $500 million. Jill, this is an idea that I talked to you about years ago. I know that you and some of your colleagues had tried to advance this kind of idea. The argument was basically that we couldn't produce enough new affordable rental housing as fast as it was being lost. Either it would be acquired by private equity and real estate investment trusts, and the rents would raise, and so those units are no longer affordable, or in some cases it might be redeveloped. And there was this trend that was being seen not just in Vancouver or BC, but in lots of different places. So the government announced this new thing. It got noticed across Canada and elsewhere. It was a big move. I'd be curious to hear what any of you guys would think about that move. $500 million for the government to be able to acquire apartment buildings, basically old apartment buildings, when they're coming up for sale, before the private sector can buy them. The nonprofit sector gets a crack at it with government support. What do you think of this?
I think that's my question for you.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I definitely want to hear Jill's answer, but I have a feeling I know what it is. But yes, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Please, no, Jill, I'd like the counters first, but I want to hear others as well.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really valuable addition to the conversation. What we've said about the rental protection fund is, in a healthy, functioning rental market, there would be no need for a program like this. But we're really far away from a healthy, functioning rental market. So I mentioned we have 400 buildings currently under development. If each of those buildings is 50 units, that's 20,000 units currently under development. In the last census period, we lost 100,000 rental homes, nearly 100,000 rental homes in this province, renting below $1,000 a month. So we're losing that stock faster than we can replace it with new affordable stock. And that's why this rental acquisition fund is really important, because it enables nonprofits, puts a little bit of equity into it, pairs it with financing to close the equity gap so that rents can be maintained at affordable rates in perpetuity. And so that's the idea behind it. I think the rationale for it is strong. It's needed because we're losing so much of that stock, and people are suffering as a result.
Wendy.
Well, I think what I would say is that certainly not opposed to it, and Jill's really explained well why it's needed. But one of the reasons why it's needed is we just aren't building enough supply. And so with any of these government programs, I sort of look at, is it helping with the underlying fundamental problem, new supply? We're just changing who owns the supply that's in the affordable level, but it's not contributing to a solution. And in fact, by not building more housing, we're actually making, this challenge worse, because we have lots of people coming into this market with great jobs. They can afford whatever housing's available. And so since we're not building new for them, they're, renting some of the older stock and it's effectively displacing that opportunity from someone with less money.
We've seen the leaders of some of these big real estate investment trusts who are buying up 50, 60, 70-year-old apartment buildings have commented that the reason it's such an attractive investment class is precisely that it's so scarce. They're not in Canadian urban markets. We haven't built as much apartment buildings as we did for several decades earlier. And so because it's scarce and it doesn't seem like the shortage is going away anytime soon, it's an attractive investment class. But of course, you're not dealing with a
different kind of investment classes, people's homes, and so that has.
Yeah, well, and sometimes the whole industry gets a bad name from some of this, but some of what they're buying up is really old product with a lot of deferred maintenance. Roofs that are leaking, elevators that don't work, appliances, everything, and they're coming in and fixing that up. So they're actually giving some new life to that stock. So we do have to recognize that. But the other thing again to think about this capital that's coming in and buying those, some of that capital would much rather be building new. But they can't. It's so hard. And again, if it's especially whether you're a REIT or whether you're a pension fund, at some level, you can't just have this money just sitting on a piece of land for 7 years, hoping you're going to get a chance to build something or get something at the end. You need to have that income. And so buying an older building and going through this gets you that income flow faster, which is what, your pension funds or your investors are needing. So that's something that's, part of it. But at the end of the day, it's because we're not enabling enough new supply to be built. And so it creates a whole cascading range of problems, including, what Jill, explained really well.
John, your response.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, and I get Jill's explanation that it's a protective measure, that housing fund was a protective measure. But, let me step back and say, take a look at the Broadway Corridor Plan that was approved by Vancouver City Council late last year and near the end of their term. It's primarily a rental-focused community plan that really does reward or attempt to reward significant densification for primarily rental dedicated purposes, very little condominium in that zone. And necessarily, the vast majority of projects that are going to get built in that zone are going to displace a portion of existing aged rental stock. And so it's sort of a mixed signal to say, evil developers, we're going to stop you from buying these old apartment buildings and displacing the people in them, which I get is a serious issue that needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. But at the same time, David Eby strongly supported the Broadway Corridor Plan. Previous Mayor Kennedy Stewart told me he felt like David Eby was sitting on his desk every day waiting for that plan to get approved. And it is going to create massive displacement. And there's plans to how to address that and how to compensate tenants and bring them back at discounts and so on. And that's sort of being parsed by the development industry now. So it's sort of speaking out of both sides of your mouth saying, let's not let developers buy these old rental buildings, but at the same time, let's promote a plan that's gonna literally replace hundreds of rental buildings over the coming years with big brand new buildings that are gonna replace them.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the nub of it, that displacement issue. It kind of comes back to that, right? We've got to maintain the social license to be able to deliver the supply. And if you don't have policies in place that are around that, and I think this is one attempt to do that. And, there are other ways that we can get at the same issues. But, reflecting back 6 years ago to when we initiated the policies in City of North Vancouver, which were supply-based, the idea was, yes, you were potentially going to rehabilitate or tear down an older building. People are going to get displaced, but you're going to have more supply. That's going to relieve some of the pressure on the housing stock. And we put in one of the first of its kind policies so that people who were in that building, they had to be relocated to another building and then find opportunities for them. That 6 years ago actually worked reasonably well. And we did it, many, many times. And I attended many public hearings, and I never once saw a tenant attend a public hearing for one of these projects because they were looked after and they found other opportunities in our housing market. Today, it's a very different story where we've got vacancy rates that are hovering around 0%. So same policy, and you're looking at, these are people who've had safe and secure housing for, decades. Mind you, it is market housing and it is housing that's reached the end of its functional life, but they've got nowhere to go. And now they're faced with, I've not only got to leave my community, I might have to leave the region. So it's a significant issue. And I think, solving that issue at the same time as we solve the supply issue is what's going to enable us to move forward here.
So who solves that issue, though? Is it a private equity that is going to come in to fill that gap, or is it going to be through a wide variety of programs to bolster the nonprofit sector to fill many elements of that gap? Because when I think about people who are being displaced, they've been under the protection of slowly increasing rents that are grandfathered back to what they started on. Suddenly you're saying, no, we're displacing you, and you're moving back out into a market that's probably not within your income range.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's both. And, I think, John's points are well taken. We do need to speed up approvals. We do need to generate supply. We've got a lot to do on that topic. But at the same time, you look at, I think the lower 20% of income earners in Metro Vancouver can't afford any market housing whatsoever. So something has to happen there, right? And in our region, I think we've got, Jill might have the numbers off the top of her head, but I think it's around 7%, social housing and nonprofit housing in total as a region. Now you look at 20% are priced out entirely of the market. So, how do you address that? And I think that's when you start getting to, we do have to rethink our housing delivery system in BC at the same time as we're leveraging that private equity and delivering supply. So it's a yes and.
Yes, Jill, yes.
I just want to go back to something that John said, and really it's around displacement for sure and land use. So, if the only place that we're allowing rental buildings to be built are where rental buildings already exist, we're going to have a displacement issue. There's no way around that. We have to really take a solid look in this region about how we're using our land. The easy stuff is done. There's no more greenfield development. Industrial sites have now been converted into residential districts. And now we're kind of going piecemeal through zones where rental housing is already allowed, whereas the vast majority of our residential space in this region and in the city of Vancouver is zoned for single-family housing. And I think that's where we need to, if we're worried about displacement, we need to be taking a serious look at who gets housed where in the city.
That is a really important point. The number of single-family homes in the region is it's out of line with the need.
Like the geometric area.
Yeah.
It's massively, the city is dedicated, on a map, is dedicated to the lowest form of housing, lowest density form of housing we have.
Okay, you're a city councillor, and I come to you now and say, you have to tell those people in their homes that, sorry, you can't have a single-family home. Over the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to enact this, but don't go to the polls and vote me out.
Yeah, well, I'll go back to what I said before, that it's the fox guarding the chickens. The housed and the comfortably housed are primarily the most influential decision makers in electing and, more importantly, unelecting politicians. And renters probably, I would say, it might not be totally true, but I've given the kind of transient nature and overstressed nature that a lot of them are living, working hard and making ends meet, probably aren't as well represented in the voting system as well. So this is where we had hopes that Minister Eby and now the Premier Eby was going to really, intervene in a very significant way to force municipalities to break through this. And the political calculus is that they can blame the senior level of government. They can say, hey, sorry, we have to I totally agree with Jill. Sorry, we have to rezone your single family neighborhood. And they are doing some of that, granted, but we're being told by senior government to do so. And one of the other things we suggested to the minister was, don't just give the province the stick and tell people in single family areas that they have to be rezoned. Make it cost something, right? Create a taxation regime where it's very difficult and very painful to continue to defend that type of inefficient land use. And, ultimately people will follow the dollar and they'll move in that direction. So I totally agree that we just keep mowing over the old rental with the new rental, and we go through all this angst and disruption and, very difficult situations for people because we won't go outside these arterial boundaries where renters always were.
A few years ago, I interviewed a woman from Oakland, California, who had organized people who were wanting to rent. And she said, when there's a council meeting, who shows up? Mm-hmm. The people who show up are the ones that you pointed out who live in that neighborhood. Right. And she said she started to organize people who wanted to live there, and they became represented before council saying, hang on, I'm a young family. I'm a single mother. I'm a working professional. That's where I want to live too. And you're telling me I'm not allowed to live here. And it had an impact on council. Do you think that that's a good idea?
I think that's already happening. I think Housing Vancouver does a very good job at getting, renters from across the region out to support rental housing or other
and
other
it
kinds
changed
of
with
housing.
COVID when people could phone into a public hearing. Huge a lot.
Yeah, and I think we do have to look at those public hearings, like, who is represented at them. And I was asked to speak at one in Kitsilano, that sort of infamous fourth in Balaclava, 35 units that took 6 days. And because I'm a researcher, I thought, let's learn a little bit more. I used to live a block away from there, so it's partly why I was asked. And I thought, well, let's learn a little bit more about what's been happening in this Kitsilano area, and discovered that there basically been almost no new housing added in. I think I looked sort of back about 3 censuses in the housing stock, and there was almost nothing new compared to this region. And then I also looked at the demographics of the region, and it was about 90% white and about 8% Chinese Asian and 2% everybody else. And that doesn't reflect our region at all. First, and it was obviously slightly older demographic too. Our region is 50%, more than 50% non-white, and 50% foreign born. And so I think when it starts to reflect, there's a missing equity, diversity, inclusion, reconciliation piece in these hearings when most of the people speaking were probably white and over the age of 55, defending Kitsilano as they knew it, and somehow these 35 rental units were going to bring in crime. They were going to, bring shadows. This is 35 units. It's not very big, but it was going to change their neighborhood as they knew it. And so that history in Vancouver, obviously, of gatekeeping, or certainly the white colonials came in, pushed away the Indigenous people, put a lot of restrictions on housing in terms of what other ethnicities could buy and not, own, and where they could live. So I think that's something we need to think about in this region at public hearings, is how are they more representative of everyone in the region and the needs of everyone in the region? And why do we let one group gatekeep the housing stock? And that's what we've been doing. And so we think, the elected officials will say, well, majority of the neighborhood doesn't like it, so I'm going to vote against it. Well, you're not, you should need to be representing society and not just, an exclusive group in a neighborhood.
Single city, right? We don't have
wards.
Yeah. So that brings up the ward question. Would it help?
It's even worse.
No.
Worse?
Sure.
I think the markets across the country where there's a ward system, they become very dependent on that very exclusive group of people for their job, and so they do have to be seen to be representing them. Whereas at least in Vancouver, I actually like that they're at large, and you need to represent the.
I think you could say a lot of things about the public hearing process, but really, fundamentally, it comes down to we have a highly transactional planning system in British Columbia where almost every project has to go through that approval process, regardless of, is this project of a significant enough scale that, yes, we do really need to do all the supplementary studies. We do need to have, a fulsome public discourse around those things that get mentioned at public hearings, like traffic and shadows and other things. Or, is this a pretty poor form of project that ought to be as of right? And in many other places, you've got many more projects that go through the as of right approval, which means that it's already zoned. You do still need to go through, a design review, and you still have to get building permits, but you don't go through that public hearing process. And I think with some of the legislative changes, we saw the province kind of nudge in that direction, but still, municipalities have to look at how do you change these zoning codes to get to the point where you can move from a system where you've got, 98% of projects going through a discretionary approval to some as of right. And that's actually a tough question because, it's a planning culture, but beyond a planning culture, that's how municipalities get other things that have made Vancouver a really great and desirable place to live in the first place. So absent that tool, what do you replace that with? And, then you get back to legislative changes are required.
Like the change where they changed the charter or the community legislation that a council could waive the need for a public hearing if a project was OCP compliant, but they just made it an option to waive. Mm-hmm. I think the mayor of North Van, right, was the first one to do that.
Yep.
We're suggesting that industry's suggesting that they change that rule so that a municipal council can't have a public hearing for a project that's OCP compliant. that would be a good way to move that legislation further.
We've had a very enabling relationship, I think, between the province and municipalities in this province that doesn't exist in all provinces. And we see that through some of the legislative changes. So more recently, yes, decisions could be delegated to staff if they were consistent with official community plans. The challenge is official community plans are, and this to your point, Michael, are often very out of date and vague. And I think the real opportunity for citizen engagement is, what do our communities across the city and across the region look and feel like? Where do we want housing to go? Where do we want amenities to go? Rather than a project by project basis that pits people against each other. And the reality is, nobody who is, I'm okay with that building going in down the street, I'm not going to spend 5 hours at a public hearing to get up and say that. It really enables and favors the negativity. There was one building in my neighborhood, 5 single-family houses came down, a 3-story building went up, and one of the rarities in Vancouver, it didn't need to go through a public hearing because it was consistent with the Grandview Woodland Plan. A young planner had her life threatened at the information session. That's how vitriolic it was. Building opened last year. There's a great new bakery there. People are lined up around the block to get their baked goods on Saturday morning. Once a building is in a community, it becomes part of the fabric of that community. But people are resistant to the change because it's different from what they know. So there needs to be a way around that.
We promised viewers that we would respond to some of their questions that came in. Sean, you've got a question here from a viewer.
There's quite a few questions coming in about how government can financially encourage investment. And I'll read one here from Robert Wilson. It says, why are governments not supporting private investment into social housing, supportive housing, low-income housing, etc.? Give private developers tax credits and waive all federal, provincial, and municipal taxes on rental for 5 years.
Didn't we do that in the 1980s in essence?
Yeah.
MERB.
Yeah, it worked well. Built a ton of stuff.
Should we be encouraging federal and provincial governments to move in that direction?
Before encouraging, why don't we start with not discouraging? Like the GST that we have to pay when we build a new rental building. And believe it or not, when we renovate a rental building to, say, add life safety systems and air conditioning and other things to make it a livable building and prolong its life, we also have to pay GST. The federal government has promised on more than one occasion to eliminate GST on new rental housing. No sign of that happening. And then at the municipal and provincial level, there's any number, as I said before, of these very, very expensive processes that we have to go through. Now it's a lot of it is the sustainability agenda coming into things, which is, on its own right, laudable, but is really driving up the cost. So government could just reduce the costs and reduce the barriers. They'd see a lot more happening without direct investment. And if we need to do more from there on, we can do direct investment. One of the programs we used to have was the federal taxation system would allow you to sell if you're a professional landlord, you're in the landlord business, you could sell an asset, and provided that you took that capital gain that you've invariably made on that asset and reinvested in a new rental building within a 1 or 2 year period, you could not pay the capital gains on that. That was eliminated. So bit by bit, both by erecting taxation barriers and having very, very, very high approval standards and long timelines, government is discouraging, and they could do so much by just pulling some of that stuff back.
As you speak, I wonder, why would anybody want to step into the rental housing development market right at the moment?
Well, so here we have a situation where this, and I literally lay awake at night thinking about this. We have how many industries do you see where there's almost an unprecedented demand for product, rental housing, at just about any price, $6-7 a square foot. And we are shutting down the factories. So the developers are the factories. We're virtual factories. And we are shutting our factories down right now because of all the resistance to building rental housing. The ones we've talked about, government can't really blame them, or they can't easily fix the cost of construction or interest rates. But when those two things are running in a negative direction, they should be working even harder to get out of the way. what we see is them just micromanaging and controlling and taking a cut, taking a slice. I was talking to a developer the other day who has a rental project in East Vancouver with 20% of the units below market, 20% below market CMHC average, which is really low. And he's sitting on a $20 million ask from the city for community amenity contributions. So, it's just, call me a complaining developer, but that's all I do all day, every day is try and build stuff. And just the number of things that they throw in your way is remarkable. So to be talking about how can we build more housing, this massive private sector who's not going to solve all the problems, I get that, but can build tens and tens of thousands of units. And literally they're just standing in our way at every step we try to take.
There's an interesting book out right now called A New Spirit of Capitalism, and they talk about governments and free enterprise working together to solve the big societal problems that we all face. But it points out that unless there is a stable, consistent legislative framework where everybody understands that this is the way that it is and is going to be for a long period of time, it's very, very difficult to get private equity to say, okay, I'm going to come forward. But when you bring that private equity, you also bring with it remarkable innovation. But is that anathema to what we want to do in the housing market?
Yeah, so I speak to that one. I mean, I think my colleagues here may disagree, but I think there's a place for the public-private partnership component of requiring those inclusionary units, as we call them, or the non-market units that are delivered with a private project. And I think if you design that policy well and repeat it across the region, that could have a massive effect in addition to, loosening some of the strings that enable the supply of rental housing. But I think to your point, you have to do that consistently in a way that's predictable. And what we've got now is 21 municipalities. Some of them have policies, some of them don't. Each one has a different requirement for the rent level or the number of units and how that works. And it's a confusing landscape to operate in, and it's hard for capital to navigate that landscape. So I think as Metro Vancouver, that is one of our roles, is trying to provide some of the best practices and research out there so that policies like that can be more effective and ideally a little bit more consistent across the region.
Dan?
So, Michael, I'm glad you mentioned that. There's 21 municipalities in Metro Vancouver, and you touched on the success that the city of North Vancouver, where you used to work, had in encouraging rental housing production. But as you say, it's a postage stamp of a municipality in this broader region. The district of North Vancouver is immediately to the north. West Vancouver is immediately to the west. There's some other municipalities that haven't traditionally been as amenable to adding new purpose-built rental housing. So if a given city council or city hall staff is successful or wants to encourage rental housing, how much of a difference can it have if you've got this checkerboard or patchwork of different municipal governments with different approaches, and if some are encouraging rental housing and others are not, how successful can we be in the program? And now that you're working at Metro Vancouver for the regional government, how quickly will you fix this?
Those are the intractable questions that keep us all awake at night, right? And it does seem like you're running faster and faster all the time to stay in the same place on some of these topics. And it can be very dissatisfying if you're one of those municipalities that's over-delivering and you recognize there's no, the boundaries are artificial and the issues are regional. So how do we get at that? And one of the ways we get at it is regional planning, which looks at what do we need to do collectively? What do we need to do in each subregion? But I think the other way, in terms of where the conversation is going right now, and back to John's earlier piece here, is like the province is stepping in and realizing we have a collective action problem. It doesn't work unless all the actors are at the table and all the actors are contributing. So how do we get there? And I think there are different ways to go about that, and we're about to experience one of them, which is to impose a housing target on certain municipalities. Hasn't been announced which ones, and then potentially to have some actions that are put into place if those municipalities don't deliver those housing targets. I think there are other ways through strong regional planning and through collaboration to get there. But I think we're about to see that collective action problem and some solutions to it in action in our region.
So you're saying you think the Premier is moving in the right direction, where he's starting to signal, if you're not moving fast enough, I'm going to override you and I'm going to make things happen.
I think it's certainly a very consequential change to the way that planning works in British Columbia. I think there are different ways to go about that, and certainly as Metro Vancouver with municipal members, that we'd be looking to do that in a way that collaborates with the individual municipalities. And I think the province is saying that, we're going to work with individual municipalities in setting these targets. So we'll learn the details. The regulations haven't been written yet on the Supply Act, but it'll be very interesting to see how the province goes about that.
Wendy?
Well, what I was just thinking about, completely, agree that, and I'm hopeful that Michael's right. There's going to be some push on supply. What I worry about is it's too little, too late. That said it takes 7 years or more. John can probably talk about if you have to go through a public hearing in Vancouver, how many years it takes to get a building built. And we have a crisis now, and we've got these targets for by 2030, 2032, or at least we know how much more rental housing we need. Our models have it probably 150,000 units of purpose-built rental needed by 2032.
In what geographic
Lower
means? All Lower Mainland, not places of
Metro Vancouver.
Okay.
And how do we get there? There's, 10,000 units under construction right now. It's kind of been the flow, net 3,800 finished last year. We need probably to be tripling, quadrupling that. And yet the capital's leaving because it's so difficult to get things under construction here. So I worry, I think the consistency across the region, consistency of what you can expect is absolutely needed. What I worry with what's coming is it's not going to be fast enough to keep the capital here and ready to build. And so by the time it comes back, and even other things, as John mentioned, interest rates and construction costs maybe come down. We're now another 5 years down the road, and we haven't been solving the problem. And so now we need even more people need non-market housing. So that's what I worry is this is moving. It's the right idea. Is it moving fast enough to help the situation?
Can I just go hide under a rock right at the moment and hope that this will go away? Because the more you talk, the more I worry that we're not going to find solutions.
Well, that's what the cities are doing. They're pulling the cover over the head, turning out the light, and hoping that the monster doesn't come in the room. That's literally what they're doing. They're afraid of the political consequences of making the necessary changes that need to be made. So they're, to varying degrees, the different municipalities are all just hiding. I thought it was interesting. The Premier's new infrastructure fund, $1 billion divided, and I'm starting to learn a little bit more about it, divided across, I think, 152 municipalities. And we're hearing that that fund is going to be divvied up according to a population, but also whether or not a municipality is over or under their housing targets, which need to be updated. And I think this is quite clever, and it may just be the beginning of a lot more of that. This is not the stick, this is the carrot. If a municipality goes and applies or looks at what they get from this grant and realizes that, hey, first of all, there's nobody here, and secondly, we're not even building enough houses for those people, they're going to get $6 of the $1 billion, right? And other municipalities that are achieving and exceeding their growth targets and having good growth in their populations are going to start to see the benefit. Okay, now we can build the rec center. Now we can build the new sewer line. Now we can do what we need to do. And I think that part of it is what the municipalities, there needs to be a bookend, right? One side of the books is, pushing back against the growth from the community engagement. Mm-hmm. The other side of the bookend needs to be look how we can benefit and how our community can benefit if we do some of this tough decision making.
So that sounds like an interesting idea, but so much of it appears to me to be window dressing, because you say $1 billion spread out over 162 communities for infrastructure development. Well, what are you going to build for that?
Yeah.
And $500 million to protect some older buildings. The numbers have to be significantly higher.
He may be trying to point the way for the feds to a degree as well with that, and trying to encourage them to do something similar.
Yeah, I think there are encouraging signs, I think, in the last few months, pointing at a potential direction for the future. And one of them is, to tackle the, what John would characterize as an overregulation issue. From my perspective, regulation exists for a reason, right? We have health and safety. We're going to make sure people aren't living on contaminated sites. We're going to make sure buildings are accessible, and we're going to meet higher environmental standards. All of these are good things. This is what we want.
Not to mention earthquake standards. All we need to do is take a look at what happened in Turkey in the last couple of weeks.
And so these standards are good. I think what the challenge has has been layering over time, right? And so that leads to policy incoherence, right? So you've got two policies now that are not necessarily saying the same thing. And it means everything's become more siloed. And so the province has announced a permitting strategy for housing, which I actually think is quite hopeful. It's going to take time. It's not a silver bullet. There are no more silver bullets in this complex problem that we're facing. But it's going to ensure you've got one set of eyes rather than, 92 different sets of eyes looking at either the same application or different applications that need to go in for different things. So I also think we'll see some streamlining on the provincial permitting side.
Is that with fingers crossed, your hope?
Always, I never uncross my fingers these days. They're always crossed.
But hope isn't a plan, is it? And that's the hard part.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing some positive indications. To Wendy's point, it is a frustrating environment to be in when you've been sort of signaling at the impending crisis and the worsening crisis for years and years and years. So yes, we're seeing action. Is it enough? Probably not, but we're starting to see the right signals. But these things are going to take time. We will not start to turn the corner on this crisis for some time.
Let's go back to another question from Slido.
A bit of a different question, something we haven't addressed yet, from Nathan. Why aren't we limiting Airbnbs? They're taking away a lot from the rental market.
Sorry, aren't we limiting Airbnbs? I mean, they're illegal.
Yeah, I thought
Individual municipalities can enact bylaws through their zoning code or business license regulations to regulate them in different ways, but they're not regulated in a provincial capacity. It's a land use decision that individual municipalities are making. So you'll see Vancouver has a fairly comprehensive set of guidelines around when you can do it, when you can't. Some municipalities have none at all. Others have, strict guidelines there. But I think there's a very active conversation on that topic in British Columbia. The conversation there, I think, went a little bit by the wayside during the pandemic because you saw some of the pressure come off, and many of those units were turned back into the rental market, which I think was very helpful during that time. But we're starting to see now, those numbers are inching up again. So I think there'll be a very active conversation. I think we've heard from the province that this is on their legislative docket to look at some province-wide framework for how this is regulated.
Dan, I thought you had another question there.
Well, I don't have anything else on Airbnb, but I'd love to talk about rent control. Okay. I got a feeling John might have something he'd like to share on this. The provincial government has capped the maximum allowable rent increase at below the level of inflation. We've heard John talk about how government needs to get out of the way, and Wendy making the point that institutional capital, which funds a lot of rental housing construction, needs reliability and needs to be able to project. And obviously, if rent increases are capped, understandably, institutional investment is frightened or worried. But then we look at some other markets. So in Seattle, which in some ways is a similar housing market to Vancouver with expensive real estate, they've had a big rental housing construction boom. And I don't think there's the same rent controls that we have. And they also have a really big homeless problem. Bigger homelessness problem than Vancouver has, and we all agree Vancouver's homeless population is way too big for a city that's as wealthy as we are. So is there some role for the government to play in controlling rents? Seattle, you have a way higher rental vacancy rate. There's a lot of empty apartments, while a lot of other people are sleeping without homes. How does rent control factor into there? Should there be any rent control, or should there be a stricter vacancy control that ties to the unit and not the individual tenant?
Well,
John?
There's a long tradition in British Columbia of rent control. I don't think it's probably realistic to expect that we'd ever become, in any reasonable time period, a non-rent controlled environment. I think the bigger issue is just the slow chipping away and undermining of those regulations on the viability of rental housing. We had 2% plus inflation, then we had inflation, then we had 0 and 1, I think, during COVID, and then Premier told me himself directly when he was a housing minister that they would not monkey around with the rental housing inflationary adjustment to rental housing. And sure enough, they just decided that although inflation's running at 6% and cities like Surrey are increasing their property taxes by 17%, et cetera, that they're going to just arbitrarily force landlords to sit on an arbitrary, I think it was 2% increase in rents. And this is what really, you were talking about capital needing kind of certainty and predictability. Wendy's pension fund clients need to be able to say, okay, average turnover is X, and we get rent increases there when we go to market, so no vacancy control. And then for the rented part of the building, we can project inflation. It might be wrong. We can project it. We'll get rent growth. And every time they come along and just kind of monkey around with the regulations for purely political purposes, for popularity purposes, they undermine the confidence of that capital. And I've had BCIMC Quadreal, who is investing the pension earnings of the government employees of the province of British Columbia, including all the city workers and all the municipal politicians, say that if vacancy control comes in, they will not build in BC rental, period, full stop. Because it blows up their ability to project and have reliable rent growth to pay out the pensioners who are working at the city, making up the rules that stop us from building rental housing. So, it's very dangerous. It's not going to go away, but why can't we have inflation? What is it about the private real estate sector that it's forced to subsidize housing so that the incumbent tenants in our region are renting for 48% less than the people who have to rent and pick up a new unit? Why is our industry in particular that's needed to create new housing being forced to subsidize 50% of the population with below market rents? We're not happening with groceries or airline tickets or cars.
I mean, just housing. The industry's making big profits as well and is doing very well during a period of high inflation.
Yeah.
Wendy?
Mm-hmm.
I saw.
Yeah. Well, okay. On range. Well, I was mostly just agreeing with John actually that it's a challenge for certainty. How do you make things work in this market? And if we think back to when it was CPI +2, Ontario was CPI, so this market for attracting capital, that looked okay. And there was more available stock, as well, so that there was options for people to move around, and there was some turnover. And now, of course, we're below inflation. Well, Ontario is roughly doing the same, I believe, if I remember correctly. But I think the one other piece of this, in terms of what they're trying to, going back to Dan's question, is we don't have enough non-market rental housing. So who we're really trying to protect are people of the lower incomes that need to rent from Jill and her colleagues and the nonprofit sector. And yet we're doing a very blunt instrument, because a lot of the people who rent, and I pull the stats, custom polls from the census, we give a lot of renters making well over 100,000. We talk on UDI rental committee about, what does it look like in our different buildings? Not us, not John, another rental provider. They had some people with 7-figure incomes renting in their buildings. So this rent control applies to everybody, whether you make, or combine a couple each making, maybe they're, an engineer and a doctor, and they're making $500,000 a year and they're renting because they like that lifestyle or they don't know where they want to live. They're new to the market. They're getting protected by rent control, as well as people who really need it. And so that's the thing with the rent control. It's a very blunt instrument. And I think, maybe we need to look at, is there a way to give more subsidies to people with low incomes so they can afford their rents, rather than really capping the rents for everybody? And we despite what you hear in the media, we're tracking, where are wages going. There's a lot of housing market, or a lot of income out there from people who rent or as well as buy, but in this market, and salaries and wages have been going up. And, especially for renters and what we're tracking. So, and new people moving to this region. So there is a lot of, I'm not saying everybody, I'm just saying there's a lot of people out there that can afford their rents, could afford an inflationary rental increase this year. And yet we're protecting them, and it's keeping, from having to pay that. And it means that we end up with less housing, and then that's bad for everybody.
From your perspective, Joe, the rent control, how does it impact your sector, both positively and maybe it has its limitations or negative sides to it as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Our sector exists to meet the housing needs of people whose needs are not met by the market. So to Wendy's point, that used to be 10% in the 1970s. Now it's significantly more. There are more and more working professionals whose needs are not met by the market. We can't build out supply fast enough in our sector to achieve that challenge immediately. On the rent control issue, I agree that predictability is really important. When we have looked at jurisdictions that have had either lighter or no rent controls, so Ontario didn't have rent controls in new purpose-built rental for a long time. Not a lot of new rental was built at that time. New Brunswick doesn't have rent controls. We're not seeing new rental built at that time. So it's not to suggest that capital is not going to leave if controls are too tight, but there has to be something more to explain the lack of new rental development beyond rent controls.
I was speaking to Ryan Beatty a couple of weeks ago, and he posed the question. We have underutilized land throughout the Lower Mainland, and some of it sits vacant for months and months and months on end, only to be used for a fair. Why? Why do we have so much underutilized land, and what can we do to pull that into the mix? And maybe we create special, rules and regulations around how we're going to develop those properties.
Yeah, and we know that we don't have a shortage of lands. I mean, that is one of the things that we look at. Sure, we're a constrained region. We've got the mountains on one side, the border, that narrative that we all know. But we've already talked about in this conversation, how much of the land base is either underbuilt or there are indeed, a significant number of vacant lands all through the region. And some of these lands are in really well-positioned places where we've done many things, I think, better than a lot of regions in terms of aligning where growth is happening and some of our investments in transit. But we do have a ways to go on that. And I think some of it comes down to tax structure. And that's a complicated subject. But, when you've got a tax system that doesn't provide that incentive to develop the land, it's more likely to sit there. So that's something that could be looked at. And then it comes back down to, land use, of making some of those lands, easier to release onto the market and, to get developed, because I think we need to be doing that.
So does that happen, though, at the individual city or municipal level, or can you have a more regional impact when it comes, especially if we focus on underutilized lands?
Yeah, I think, the region's an influencer and it does, research and best practices, and it sets out, a growth pattern for the region. But then the implementation happens at the level of the individual municipalities. So it's those municipalities that are putting into place their official community plans. They have to be consistent with that regional plan. And then they're putting in, enabling regulations, whether land use, development controls, the other things that we've been talking here. So there are ways to, bend those regulations to make it more attractive to develop in Area A versus Area B, or to disincentivize, that vacant land staying vacant. So there's certainly ways to do that. And the other element of it is public lands. We certainly have a lot of public land that is underutilized, and it's underutilized because it's owned by an agency that has a mandate. But could it be, yes, that and, this is a location for housing. And, we've looked at, some of the quantum on that, and, you get to quite staggering figures fairly quickly across the region in terms of what could be done. So I don't think there's a land shortage. It is about, how do you deploy some of these properties more effectively?
Isn't TransLink looking at starting to get into that business a little bit?
They're allowed to now. The legislation change, yeah.
Is that a significant changer? If you can have rental housing above rapid transit station, there's a population that we know is more likely to use transit, and it's
I think it could
transit
be.
ridership. And
yeah, certainly. And agencies becoming a little bit more entrepreneurial is maybe an effective way to capture that land lift that we're talking about, which right now we're doing, through the laborious process of CACs or individual negotiations. Well, governments can become a player in purchasing that land, maybe even before an investment's made in transit. And when the investment arrives, you capture that value, and that goes back into public amenities, whether those be housing or whether they be other social objectives of the government. So I think that's a big place for some innovation.
I remember Bob Lee suggesting that when they were building the Canada line, and there was no uptake on it. Mm-hmm. Did we miss the boat there? And are we
sitting in on Broadway? Yeah. Any of the suggestions going in on Broadway, except for maybe one or two PCI, I think have anything on top of them.
Yeah, the PCR.
Yeah. But look, industrial land. Sorry, go ahead.
No.
There was a recent community plan for the False Creek Flats, which is something in excess of 400 acres of underutilized industrial land, like less than a mile from Brardon, Georgia. And industry was heavily advocating for, yes, you need industrial, you need light industrial, office industrial in that area. We'll build what you're already expecting in terms of industrial, 5 FSR or whatever, and we'll put rental on top of it. You can take the elevator to work. And this, a lot of these problems that we're having are kind of rooted in this 60s era planning thinking where like you live over there and the factories over there and the shopping centers over there and, you know, the retails and the ports over there. And there's a real concrete thinking in the planning disciplines and about bringing uses back together. But that there's huge opportunity there to do light industrial with office light office uses with residential on top. And actually, instead of that idea threatening that industrial getting created, building that residential will actually cause that industrial to get created, would actually drop the cost of industrial rents as well, because there'd be so much of it getting built to put the rental on top. So a lot of these, like we encounter a lot of just kind of weird, old-fashioned thinking and I think that someone said something to me recently, which is really interesting, that we should really be going into the universities and seeing what planners are actually being taught. Because a lot of what you deal with when you deal with these people is kind of this channel thinking that they have coming out of university. And a lot of it is really misinformed and really out of date.
Wow. So to that end, I mean, it's certainly not my job to stick up for municipal employees or regional government employees. But what would you say to those, some viewers out there who might say, well, maybe these people might make mistakes or work in archaic systems or whatever occasionally, but it is their role to stick up for the sort of public good. And the private sector, as much as we rely on the private sector, and in housing, we heavily rely on the private sector. If we just let them do whatever they want, that's not necessarily in the best interest either.
Nobody's advocating that, but I don't think they actually are looking out for the public good. And I don't mean that they're working against the public, but actually what they're looking out for is the policy. We have a saying at UDI that the policy is the client. And what happens for these planners is year after year, decade after decade, councils come and go and just keep pushing this idea, this policy, trees, this driveway, that, sustainability, green roof, energy performance. They just keep pushing it onto the planners. And the planners' role accidentally, I think, becomes to represent this body of work that they've worked on for their bosses who are, successive councils. And there, the policy is the client. So when you go to make an application for development, they're not looking at you going, how do we get your development to work? They're going, how do we stop you from breaking the policy? And that's why, and it's not really their fault. I mean, we've got to get the politicians have got to go in and say, get rid of a bunch of that policy or put it on the side for now. Or no, I'm not talking about like safety and building code and size. I'm just talking about all this stuff, right?
Well, as Jill had pointed out, layering on.
Yeah, layering and incompatibilities. And then on top of that, culturally in these municipalities, we have a kind of, they call it consensus, like it's a weather system that came over them one day, like a cloud called consensus. And they actually don't know how to make decisions as an organization because everybody has their role, everybody has their little body of work that they represent. And the executives in those organizations don't really have the mandate to say, I know you wanted that driveway there and I know you wanted the tree there. This is what we're going to do. Thanks for your opinion, but this is what we're going to do. We're going to move ahead. They don't do that. They just wait until everybody agrees and then it finally moves ahead. And that's one of the reasons everything takes so long. It's an organizational illness. It's not just the rules themselves. It's cutting through. We all are leaders. We can sit in a boardroom and make a decision. Go, thanks for your idea. This is what we're going to do. It doesn't happen at the city.
So we're just about out of time. But out of fairness to our Slido viewers, Sean, one more question from viewers, and then I'm going to come back to each of you for sort of closing remarks about how hopeful you are that we're going to be able to find our way forward.
One other question that turns an earlier question around, looks at it from a different perspective regarding obstructionist governments. The other way of looking at this is that development groups try to use every possible shortcut to maximize profits. Remember leaky condos. In my opinion, that's why there are such extensive government controls.
Is that an informed question?
I can answer it if you want. Leaky condos were caused by the building code and energy conservation regulations that came in the 70s and 80s, caused buildings to not ventilate properly. But that's a story for another day.
Well, and actually, just more recently, our experience with the heat dome, where more than 600 British Columbians died in our deadliest natural disaster. Some of the buildings that fared worst in our sector and where residents fared worst were newer buildings, because in our region we're not accustomed to building with cooling systems. It hasn't been required up until about 3 years ago. So. Exactly. So the dynamic is changing very, very quickly. Still a believer in regulations. I think there's a way to have good regulations in place and move things through the pipeline a little bit faster.
If I could just add something on that. I look at the purpose-built rental building developers, so groups like us, we're hoping to manage these assets for our pension clients for 20 to 25 years. So it's in our best interest to make sure that not only they meet code, but they don't leak. They may go well beyond code in terms of we've been putting cooling in. So that do you need to regulate us because we might do something wrong? Well, no, we're not. We're going to do it right because we need to manage this for the long term. This isn't a sell at once. This is we hope that we would have turnover and we would be having a chance to provide homes for people. Every year new people might move in. So I think that's just something on that of why the importance of purpose-built rental, in that it is building designed for the long term for renters, not for a one-time sale where you can sometimes run into these problems. Obviously most condo builders in this market I think build good product, but this can happen. And it's going to happen far less likely in the purpose-built sector.
So I'm not sure that we've come out of this with solutions. We've identified what challenges are. You're scaring the heck out of me. But I'm hoping that there is going to be that spirit of innovation and cooperative energy that will bring us together. Where do each of you sit on how you think we're going to do over the next 5 to 10 years in addressing a situation that is going to require significant investment and commitment to getting from where we are now to 2050, where the population of the Lower Mainland is expected to soar? Michael, I'm going to start with you.
I guess I'll take the first stab at that one. Yeah, we're solving the intractable problems, right? I mean, this is, I think we've all said it already, and it's generations in the making, and it's going to be generations in the solving. And we're kind of at that precipice now where there's a pivot point, and you don't have to go back very long, and no purpose-built rental housing whatsoever was being built, and that goes back, for a full decade and a half or more. So we're really recovering from that gap. So I see some hope in that, we're having a conversation about purpose-built rental, and we're recognizing, we're shifting as a region, that we're going to be a region of renters, and what does that mean? And the development industry is shifting over. Certainly, when I started at City of North Vancouver, no one was knocking on the door saying we want to do a purpose-built rental project. In fact, I had to convince and or force or regulate people in order to, make that possible. And that's no longer the case. We saw a lot of traditional developers transition over and say, hey, we're diversifying our portfolio and we want to do a range of things. And we know that, this is needed and there is a way to make money doing this. So I think it's in its infancy, and that's why we've got these pains. So we've got a huge, task in front of us. That maybe our systems aren't up to. And, that's the challenging component. But I think we're starting to recognize in more and more corners that those systems do need to change. And, we can do better, and the pressure is being felt. Like when you've got year-over-year increases in rents of 26% at turnover, which is what we saw in the last CMHC report, stuff starts to kind of sharpen up with a little bit of clarity in terms of, what kind of issue we've got in front of us. And I do see that there's some innovation and experimentation going on, including in the halls of local government and others. So cautiously optimistic.
Well, I'm happy to hear that there's some positive energy there. Wendy.
I think I'd add the cautious optimism in the sense of, how much long-term capital is interested in building rental housing in this market. So it's just a matter of getting some of these regulations out of the way. Finding, City of North Vancouver has found some innovations of ways to streamline, to put parallel process in. But I think at the municipal and in any government level, it's finding people. Your job is not to the policy, to John's point. Your job is to find a way to say yes to this rental housing. So you have a new role. It's to find a way to make this rental project work as fast as possible. I think with some lever changes like that, there's a lot of capital that wants this market. So I'm optimistic. Obviously, it's a generational problem to solve, but that we're going to be getting better every year.
There's 2 votes for optimism. Jill?
I would not be doing what I do if I weren't an optimist by nature. So I'm optimistic because the tide has turned, even in terms of our public conversation on housing and the housing crisis. I moved to this region in 2001, and that was what everyone was talking about at the time. Those seem like the glory days now that we're couple of decades on. And so I think when you have the leaders of all of the major banks and credit unions in this country and economists really underscoring the need to solve the housing crisis, I think that points us in a good direction. I'm seeing positive signals from certainly the provincial government. I think more and more municipalities are getting on board. The dynamic is shifting between the province and municipalities. There was a tight point there for the last year or so, but I see a lot more collaboration happening there. And at the same time, I worry. I worry about the increasing social divisions we're seeing in our communities as the crisis intensifies. And I don't think we're through the woods on that yet. And I worry about what the future looks like for people who are being priced out of this market.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I think we haven't talked about the federal government a lot. I think the municipalities, some of them are coming around. The province, certainly, if we have some stable government there, are coming around. The feds are still a huge problem because I think they really have to be the ones who put the major money behind building a lot more social housing, because the private sector, at the end of the day, can only do so much to address affordability. If you try to do more, you're just transferring costs to the other renters. And for everybody else who sort of can operate in the market, we have to de-villainize the private sector. We have to accept the fact the private sector is going to be and has always been the dominant provider of market housing. And to de-villainize and find a way to tap into that almost infinite capital that's available. Capital is global. If you provide a competitive advantage for capital, if people in the US and Europe start saying, let's put money into rental housing in Vancouver and BC because we make more there, it's almost unbelievable what you can accomplish, and also the innovation, which it tends to flourish more in the private sector. That's what we need to do. I don't know how hopeful I am that it's going to be achieved. I'd sort of call it a coin toss. I'm equally worried that this, as you say, generations in the making problem and social division, which is starting to really escalate, that governments might be forced to do even more harm to the housing market before they fix it, in an attempt to try to signal that they're trying to protect people. And that might protect the tenants more that are there, and it might protect some incoming tenants, but ultimately it'll create a huge, much worse problem. So I'm sort of 50-50 here.
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of hope from here. Well, Jill says at least we're having these conversations now, and there is this growing commitment to say, okay, let's find a solution. And I'm reminded by what Margaret Atwood said, never underestimate what a small committed group of people can achieve. And I think that we can, as so long as we keep having these kinds of conversations. This may be just the beginning, and maybe we found the corner piece of the puzzle and not the full edge. But I think that we shared some pretty good ideas tonight, and we could keep going for another few hours. But I want to thank you all for being here tonight, sharing the depth of your experience and insights. And we'll come back and visit this topic again, and hopefully it will be with even more enthusiasm and optimism. And to all of you who are watching, I want to say thank you for hanging in here with us. And this has been a remarkable Conversations Live, looking at the rental housing puzzle that we're all having to try and put together. Join us next month when we take a look at climate smart agriculture, how we can raise better food and lower the environmental impact. So thank you for joining us tonight. See you next month. Thank you for tuning into Conversations Live, an Oh Boy Productions program. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find our previous and upcoming episodes at conversationslive.ca. You can also follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Again, thank you. I'm Stuart McNish.